Hi, welcome to Mimetic Theory 101. Today's our third class in our series, and we're going to go over the principle that mimetic theory is revealed in the biblical text. The first two principles of mimetic theory is that desire is mimetic. That is, we influence one another to desire certain things. The second principle is that this shared desire can lead us into conflict with one another and leads to the scapegoat mechanism, where it's no longer about the object, it's about displacing the other. And we do that through violent means. Now today what I want to do while we're here at Lake Michigan is go over the story of Noah and the flood. Before we do that, it would be good to understand the historical context out of which Noah and the flood was written. The story of Noah and the flood was written by a people called the Judahites, the modern day Jewish people. Now the Judahites were in exile in the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian diaspora. And what happened there was that the Judahites heard the stories of the Babylonians, heard their myths. And one of those myths was a myth about a flood. And what happened in this myth briefly was that one of the gods, among many gods, was annoyed with human beings because they were loud. They were noisy. And this god couldn't sleep at night. And so he wanted to devise a plan to kill off the human beings. So he called a council of all the other gods and said, "These human beings, they're noisy. I can't sleep at night. Let's kill them. Let's cause a flood." And the other gods say, "Wow, I have been having a hard time sleeping at night. And it must be because the humans are loud. So, yeah, let's cause a flood and kill them." Well, one god doesn't like this idea. One god says to himself, why don't they just buy earplugs? Says, "I love these human beings. I've done so much with these human beings. I can't see them die like this." So he goes to one human being and says, "They're going to cause a flood. And you need to build a boat so you can survive." So this human being does. And while this flood happens, the other gods, they see the human beings drown. They see them die. And they see these human beings as innocent. They say these are innocent people. They didn't deserve to die like this. And when the flood goes away, the God that caused all of this to happen sees these human beings and these animals and says, "Who did this? They're just going to get noisy again. They're just going to make it so we can't sleep. Who did this?" And all the gods end up pointing at one another until it gets to the one god that came up with the plan. And that god says, "Why don't you just buy earplugs? I love these human beings. They don't deserve to die." And the other god says, "Who cares? Why do you care about these human beings? They're noisy. I can't sleep. Who cares about them? We can do whatever we want because we're gods." And that's how the story ends. It left the Judahites thinking, what is God like? What does this story mean? So what the Judahites end up doing is they write a critique of the Babylonian myth. They write their own flood story. And that flood story, we need to understand a few stories before. We have Cain and Abel. And this is the cause of conflict. Cain sees that Abel has this great relationship with God, and Cain doesn't think that Cain has that relationship. And so Cain gets jealous, and he envies his brother Abel. And God sees this, and God says, "Cain, master the sin that is lurking at your door." And we know that Cain couldn't do it. So Cain goes and he murders his brother Abel. And God asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" And Abel responds with the greatest rhetorical question of all time, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the story seems to say, yes, of course, you are your brother's keeper. But humans forget about this principle, that they're supposed to care for one another. And each generation after Cain and Abel gets more and more violent until you get to the story of Noah and the flood. Noah and the flood, everybody's wicked, everybody is killing each other. They're gossiping about one another. They're scapegoating one another because they're jealous and they envy one another. And so God sees this, and God is grieved to God's heart. God's not angry. God grieves this and wishes this didn't happen. And so to resolve this situation, God, like the Babylonian myth, causes a flood and says to Noah, create a boat, make a boat, bring animals on, and you'll survive this flood. And the flood comes, and all of the human beings die except for Noah. And at the end of the story, God says, oh my gosh, I should not have done that. Even though these human beings were wicked, they didn't deserve this. I will never do this again. And the symbol of that, of course, is the rainbow. The bow pointed away from human beings. It's as if the Judahite story critiques the Babylonian myth by saying, God was never violent. God never causes floods. God loves human beings even when they're wicked. Even when human beings are wicked, they don't deserve death. So, our theology states that God is nonviolent. What does that imply for our ethics? What does that mean for how we treat one another? I believe it's told in the story of the ark. Briefly, have you ever wondered how when they were all lined up, the human beings and all the animals, how did they survive in that ark for 40 days and 40 nights? The human beings, Noah and his family, looked behind their shoulder and they saw the lion. They said, how are we going to do this? They trembled with fear. The lamb looked behind the lamb and said, there's the wolf. How are we going to do this for 40 days and 40 nights? They had to forgive one another. It's radical forgiveness. How did they survive? The lion and the wolf, they had to resist their natural tendencies to kill for food, to justify killing for themselves, to make themselves feel better, to fulfill themselves. They had to resist that inclination. That's the great challenge for us today. To be a world, a community in the world where we resist our inclination to kill one another. If only we had the courage to do that. That's the great challenge of our world today. So, I hope that you'll join me next time when we begin to see how the great literature of our world has been influenced by these biblical stories. Until then, bye-bye.